the session. So I appreciate the invite from the center to come and about the book. But what I thought I would do, because the book on itself, it's really written in the perspective of saying, look, we have two agricultures in South Africa. We have the large scale commercial and of course the small scale farming. But I think the disparities that we always grapple with, because it's not an attempt of saying the country maybe should have one agriculture where everyone is commercial, but rather the challenge with South Africa is that that dualism is always on a racial terms, where you have a large scale white commercial and of course the small scale black farmers that are there. The idea then is that from a political economy perspective, that down the line may cause you some problem. And of course, it does speak then to the inequalities, which I know that everyone in the center understands fairly well. So the book was written in that perspective. And of course, then focus more on a policy approach of that, to say, what policy should we be putting in place to ensure that those that are in the tail end of that economic progress in agriculture, they migrate and to a certain extent also make some improvements over time. And I think this is captured fairly well by one of the statistics that we have in the book, which basically makes a point that black farmers in commercial agriculture in South Africa make up roughly about 11% on average of what we produce. So the idea then is to say we have to try to improve that number, and suggesting a whole range of aspects that we discuss in the book. But what I thought I would do this morning is to try and utilize a couple of slides to make my input. And I've decided deliberately not necessarily to speak on all of the details that are in the book. Some people might have read the book. Others, you may find the copy of the book. You'll see it. That's it, titled The Country of Two Agricultures, to be able to grab the copy and read it by yourself about some of the arguments that we put forward on that. But what I thought I would do is to speak on some of the policy challenges that we are facing in the near term, because I think those are important. We cannot talk about dualism when there's a whole range of things that are currently constraining progress in South Africa's agriculture, because that does mean that even those that are sitting in a commercial level, however willing they are in partnership and doing a whole range of things that uplift the new entrant farmers in agriculture, will be challenged going forward if we do not address those dynamics. Then the question is to say, what is it that the South African farmers are facing, and what should we be doing going forward to navigate those policy challenges? And I think that's my two input for this morning. And let me begin by the challenging world as we see it. And I think the first approach to appreciate is that while South Africa is, of course, a small open economy, but its agricultural sector pretty much punches above the weight when you're putting it in the global perspective. We are one of the major exporters of agricultural products. And in fact, we export about 51% of what we produce in value terms. That's just around about shy of $13 billion a year. To be exact, 2022, I think we exported a record of about $12.8 billion. That, though, does mean that a whole range of aspects that are affecting the global economy or global agricultural environment become important to the South African commercial side of the farming, and to an extent, of course, even the smallholder side. So what are these scenarios that many people that are in agriculture this year are looking at? I think the first thing that they were worried about and still worried about is the story of higher inflation across the world, because of its implication that it has on agricultural debt. Because we have a fairly high farm debt in South Africa, as inflation became a problem and interest rates increased to curb that, we began to see some pressures, because our farm debt, as we speak, it's around about 200 billion rand at the moment. And some of the aspects that we continuously think about is, of course, in the markets that we are exporting to. For example, the environmental policies in the EU, because the EU is one of our major markets. About 27% of our agricultural exports are there. When they start talking a lot about the Green Deal policies that we will deem unfavorable for production, as well as the countries that are exporting there, like limiting the use of agrochemicals, fertilizers, and all of those things. Those are some of the aspects that we look at. And I think most importantly, the uncertainties because of all of the wars, either in the Far East, in the Middle East or in the Black Sea, all of those become important. And I would say even these disruptions that seem to be brewing somewhere around about China, Taiwan, these are all of the aspects that we're looking at, and indeed the US aspects. I would say these are broad themes that many of the major agricultural and agribusinesses are pretty much looking at. But if you transition from that world perspective, we hear all of that, but that can't be pretty much blocking all of the progress. What are some of the things that are a bit of a challenge in South Africa's agriculture? And I think that you could capture it fairly well by looking at what is called the Agribusiness Confidence Index. Forget the headline and all of that, and you focus for a moment on that chart. What you read on that chart is that anything that is below the dotted line that is in the middle pretty much tells you that the sentiment in South Africa's agriculture is pretty much downbeat. And when in the last quarter of 2023, the sentiment in South African agriculture had dropped to lowest levels that we last saw in the first quarter of 2020, when we were in the first quarter of COVID, that period, and we were deep in the lockdown. And when you ask these farmers and the agribusinesses, especially the commercial ones, to say, why are you so negative about the South African agricultural sector? And they see these factors as something that could also constrain both the growth in agricultural sector, but also the small towns, to say the small towns and the rural towns cannot grow if certain aspects are not addressed. The first one starts from the point of a weaker consumer spending power, with all of the consumers under pressure. And most of you have studied the issues around poverty and all of those aspects. But I think from the farming side, people are worried a lot about this, both from a demand perspective, but also the stability in some of these communities that they are in. The issues around the municipalities that are not working, it's also one of the major issues that they complain about, animal diseases, and of course the rising interest rates that I talked about, and the ports issue. And we've seen the port story being covered quite widely in the media over the past couple of days. And I think that's something that many people are worried about. And you see, of course, the stories of the ports, both national perspective about how competitive we are, but also when you're looking at the delays that have been there in various ports on moving up the perishable products, that begins to be one of the things. And I think you appreciate that when you think back again to the point I made earlier, to say about half of what we produce in value terms, 51% to be exact, go to the export markets. So if those ports and the logistics are not up to scratch, then you begin to have a bit of more problems in as far as the profitability within your business. And that's largely, again, the commercial aspect of agriculture. And I'm going to come to the smallholder aspect in a moment. But I do think that both the commercial and the smallholder farmers are also hamstrung by these issues around the logistics. What you see, for example, in the board is two pictures of the roads in the Eastern Cape, within the Kiskamahook area, of some of the farmers that are trying to move out milk to its processing facilities. And some may appreciate the fact that the Eastern Cape, which is why I'm using it in this example, is also one of the leading milk producer in South Africa. Roughly 40% of our dairy is there. And there's a number of black farmers that have also started getting in a commercial scale of dairy within Amadlelo Agri. And all of them are really facing major challenges with the market linkages. And part and parcel of that fragmentation comes through this poor infrastructure by the municipalities. So when you think about then the port story, you think about the diseases that I had mentioned, and you think about all of these logistical aspects. These are things that the major commercial farmers, to an extent, even the new entrant farmers, say, look, if these are not addressed, regardless of some of the minor interventions that can be made, and even some of the policy changes, it's very difficult for us to see the progress within the agricultural sector and the speed at which some of the new entrant players that we would like to see coming into the sector are moving in. But I think all of this is primarily my medium-term challenges, which you see circled within that red part in the screen. Because when we think about where the sector is going long-term, say around about the next decade, we think this sector will actually continue to grow. The dotted line, for example, that you see in the screen, where we try to estimate about where the gross value added of agriculture could be over the next decade, it gives us something of saying, look, if you were to look back 2022 and scratching back to that level, you could see agriculture gross value added expanding by anything that is plus 15%. Of course, you do see the field crop line that is blue and going down on that screen. And that's not something to be concerned about. And field crops, for the sake of colleagues that have not been following agriculture closely, is anything around maize, soybean, sunflower, sugarcane. And the reason that line is going down is in two parts. The first part is the fact that it's more of a normalization following the abnormal increase in grains and oilseed prices when Russia hit Ukraine and we had those major droughts, South America, and buy a lot of commodity. And then we saw those prices increasing. And certainly that was clear in suffix. So going forward, it's really more of a normalization. But the second aspect is that we are assuming a bit of a decline in area plantings for sugarcane within the KZN area, and people going more on the horticultural line, which is the black line that you see, the second from the top on your screen, that is going up. But I think in totality, looking at the sector, this is a sector that could still grow. If then we assume that this is a growth that could come, the other thing that South Africa needs to be focusing on, and this is important again when we think about the new entrant farmers that will come in, is to open as many export markets. But this opening up of the markets is also happening at a time where protectionism is becoming a major issue across the world. I mean, if you first start by looking just our neighbor, South Africa, the likes of Botswana, Lesotho, and Libya, over really been blocking some of the exports coming out of South Africa going into their markets. Certainly Botswana and Namibia when it comes to vegetables, and of course Lesotho over the Christmas holiday, they were doing all kinds of blockages on the poultry products. But that is not much of an issue. You can work around that, all of us in this customs union. But if you look at the major markets that we're exporting to in the EU, and even the ones that we are imagining of going into India, those markets are raising a lot of protectionism sentiment that we hear coming out of that. The EU farmers are still on strike across the region, talking about that they don't want the environmental laws, which is that decline in fertilizer and agrochemicals, which from a South African perspective, we like that because it means then that if the EU lawmakers maintain the policy as it is, and they can go on a drastic decline of these agrochemicals, we will also be able to export them, because we're not going to be able to reduce the usage of inputs as fast as the EU farmers could be because of our high dependence on that, because of our poor soil structures in a number of areas. But the EU is important. Again, I made the point earlier that about nearly 30% of our exports go there. The African continent is also important because about 40% of our agricultural exports go to Africa. And 90 cents in every 1 rand that we are exporting to the continent goes to the SADC region. So in a way, you can say there are possibilities for expansion when you think about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which then makes the whole thing about the exports super important. But I think now, leaving the trade stories, I'm about to transition to the policy dynamics about what needs to be done. I just look also on the level of investments that have been put by main commercial farmers. Yes.
Wandile, may I just please ask you, there's interference with your audio, so we can't hear properly. So I don't know, maybe you can try to switch off the video and see if the audio will become a little bit better.
Thank you. Can I get an indication for other colleagues that are online, if they could hear me fine, so that we could see if it's within the lecture hall, or is it me who has a signal problem?
I can hear you very well, Wandile.
Thank you. That means then, colleagues, it's also maybe check on your side as well if the connection is well, if the online colleagues can hear very well. But I've switched the video off. Thank you for that. I think, colleagues, one of the points then, if maybe I step back a little bit to the previous slide, if the story of the exports, of course, I've made the point clear that it is very important. But when you think about that long-term growth that I was putting forward, part and parcel of that is the investment that has already been made in the sector. I made the point earlier that South African farm debt is around about 200 billion rand. You can read it as that dark blue line that you see in the screen. But the most important thing is that that money was not used by farmers to buy bakkies and all things that you see them driving on the road. They really invested that money on expanding the farming activity. And that is clear when you look at that orange blue line, or orange line that is up there, more so within the 2019 all the way up until 2022. The reason the farm debt increased a lot at that period is also the fact that we had ultra low interest rates, which then the farmers, went hard on borrowing during that period when the Reserve Bank has slashed interest rates, which is why in my opening slides, I complained about inflation and the higher rates, that the challenges that they are bringing in the sector is mainly because of that borrowing that had happened in that period. But the point is all of that money has been used productively in the agricultural sector. Now, that's the story of the reality, mainly on a commercial side. But what are we saying then could be done to grow the agricultural sector in totality? And of course, then in the next slide, to speak about how do we begin to close the dualism that is in the sector. I would summarize a couple of things that needs to be done, at least from a policy perspective or from the Department of Agriculture perspective, in about 5 points that I think are critical to see progress in this sector. The first one is animal biosecurity and the capacity at the registrar's office within the Department of Agriculture. That is super important because over the past 2 years, we've seen the expanding spread of animal diseases in South Africa. And that has been presenting major challenges to livestock farmers, to poultry farmers, to those that are in the pig industry. All of them have struggled a lot about that. But I think what's even more important is that when you look at the South African farm economy, about half of it is livestock and poultry. So if that sector that is affected by the animal diseases, then that does mean that there should be priority there. But what should this priority look like? This priority needs to be perhaps maybe in 2 or 3 ways. First, the Department of Agriculture really need to accelerate its pace of registering and approving some of the new vaccines and medicines that are needed for animals. For example, we're coming out of the avian influenza now. None of the vaccines that have been started to go through the process of approval last year have actually been approved. Much of what has been happening is that the way of control of the spread of the animal diseases is what, to a certain extent, has helped the industry rather than the vaccines being rolled out. That involves then putting more scientists and people within the registrar's office in the Department of Agriculture to be able to deal with that. The second aspect was still within that point is about the Department of Public Works doing a bit more fencing on separating the game reserves and the grazing veld. This is important mainly if you think about this, the non-commercial black farmers, because they get some of these diseases because their animals are roaming around, and mainly in some of the areas, particularly within KZN and Mpumalanga and in Limpopo, there's not a good fencing that separates some of nature reserves from the grazing veld. And diseases then are crossing off from the wild animals and getting into the cattle and leading to all kinds of things that we end up seeing also within the commercial space. And this animal diseases story begins to be more important when you're thinking about commercialization of black farmers. Because in a roughly 9 million head of cattle that we have in South Africa, 25% of that is black farmers, and it's largely non-commercial. And if you want then to commercialize and say the farmers in KZN, in the Eastern Cape, in Limpopo need to move that cattle to get into the commercial scale, those that are in the commercial space will not buy much of the animals. Mainly the disease issue, they will be concerned a lot about that, aside from the aging and the other things that they can fatten the animal in their feedlots. But one of the key issues they will have to consider, and the risk, is this animal disease thing. And that then needs to be addressed within the department. The second story, I think in the room and online, there are many people that understand about what needs to be done better than me. But the point is the ports needs to be improved, because if you have about half of your product going to the export markets, and in the coming years, you are expecting that to expand by plus 15%, then that means that you have to have really efficient ports and the logistic and the railway line and the roads to be able to handle that volume. Because as we speak, about 80% of the South African agricultural products are transported by road. And if you don't have proper trucks, and to the picture I had shown in there about the Eastern Cape and the fragmentation that causes on the value chains, especially those people who don't have capabilities of hiring these big trucks and do all kinds of interesting things, that becomes a problem. Market access is even more concerning for me, both for smallholder and the large-scale farming, because if the large-scale farmers are unable to move as much product out to a range of export markets, then they are closing also the room for the new entrant farmers within the South African market. So it's very important that we keep the sector participating effectively on the export markets, improve or sustain our competitiveness there, so that some of the local value chains are really supported by the medium scale and small farmers that are unable at the moment to actually be able to produce the product of quality that can reach the export markets. Agricultural finance is super important for the new entrant farmers. The blended finance that the Land Bank and the Department of Agriculture, and also IDC and the Department of Agriculture have structured, that is going to be very instrumental when we are thinking about how do we begin then to support and commercialize some of the farmers, so that we begin to close those dualities in the sector, along with issues of water strategy, infrastructure, and all of those things. I do think that there's a discussion which is very fundamental, and I will come to this in a moment, around the release of land. Because the South African government has accumulated quite a sizable amount of land, about 2.5 million hectares of land, via what is called the PLUS program. And this land is currently in the department's land holding account, and it needs to be released to Black South Africans with title deeds or tradable leases, so that they can tie in nicely on the financing side and begin to see themselves progressing on the agricultural sector. But before I expand a little bit about this land aspects and the other things, just a 2-point on this animal disease, and also within the export side, within the BRICS. What you see in the screen there, colleagues, is how the animal disease has been occurring in South Africa, 2015 up until to today. And you will notice that somewhere between 2021 and end of last year, there was a lot of these animal disease occurrences. The bigger bubbles that are dark brownish, that's the foot and mouth disease. The yellow ones, that's the avian influenza, and the green one, that's the African swine fever within the pig industry. The yellow one in poultry, the brownish in the cattle industry. It has a lot to do with the capacity we lost in some of the institutions like the OBP, but it also has an issue to do with climate change in general, because this trend that you are seeing of these animal disease occurrences, if you were to take the EU and map it on this graph, or you take the US and map it in graph, you sort of get a similar occurrences, not necessarily all of the diseases in this format, but I think the intensity of them over the past few years has been a challenge. China also is one that has struggled with African swine fever. So the point is, it's not clear if environmental changes are also contributing to this, and the other factors outside that, and of course the infrastructure ones in South Africa. But beyond the uptake of the Black farmers, this also has an impact in the export industry of these in the exports activity of these industries, which is why this story becomes very important. Within the export story, I do think that we need also to put a lot of emphasis within the BRICS countries, particularly India, in my mind, China, as well as Saudi Arabia are the most important markets that I think we should be looking at negotiating with them on lowering tariffs, addressing the SPS issues, which is the phytosanitary standards that are there, so that we are able to export. Because the original BRICS members are quite a sizable agricultural market of about 320 billion products that they buy each year. Saudi Arabia imports about $20 billion worth of agricultural products also. So these are a really vibrant market. And the products they import are somewhat similar to what South Africa could put into the market. So when you think about them to say we address the animal diseases, we deal with the production of the new entrant farmers, then all of this needs to go to the markets. These are some of the things that could pretty much be done. But I don't want to sound like, yes, it's two agricultures, nothing has been progressing in South Africa's agriculture, because progress has been there. If you think back, for example, in 1994 up until to today, South Africa's agricultural output in value and in volume terms has more than doubled. Improvements in productivity through the use of better seeds, varieties, genetics in animal, better management of the soil has contributed to that. And also this story of expanding export markets has contributed in that. And even more importantly, if you think about 2012, when the NDP get launched, and there's a whole range of things that agricultural sector had to do, and there were targets that were set out in Chapter 6 of the NDP. We've actually overachieved some of the targets and closer to achieving some. The ones that are written in green are the ones that we have overachieved those targets. The target is the orange bars that you see there, where the progress is on the blue bars. If you think about the citrus, the macadamia, apples, table grapes, berries, soybeans, we've overachieved the targets. In the dairy industry, we're nearly there, and it's not even 2030 that we're looking at. Avocados, 60% there. On poultry, of course, still lagging 30% of that target. And there's a clear dilemma about what has been hindering that. But again, the issue with this progress in South Africa is still the fact that we've expanded more in the commercial sector, but the black farmer participation within that progress has remained in the periphery. And I'm going to end with the two slides that speaks to that black farmer dilemma that is there. But let me make a point of saying the expansion that has happened, which is why I kept talking about the exports, it will put pressure on the infrastructure. Because if you look in that chart that is in the board, there are dark blue bars and there are light bars. The light bars with the figures that are at the top, those are non-bearing fruits that will give us fruit within the next 5 to 8 years. These are trees that are already on the ground, and we will not be able to absorb that fruit in the South African market. It has to go elsewhere for profitability to remain at healthy levels within this industry, which again talks to this story of exports. But let me talk a bit about what is fundamental for the farmers to also join this commercial activity. I would start it off, colleagues, with this point about the land access. I made the point that the government has about 2.5 million hectares of land via its PLUS program. That's the proactive land acquisition strategy. It's currently sitting in a land holding account. The first thing that needs to be done is to transfer that land to Black South Africans with title deeds. Because it makes no sense for a government to be accumulating land and actually not transferring it to its initially targeted beneficiaries. But then you have to select the beneficiaries in a proper way, because we know from works of Professor Ruth Hall, Dr. Tembeka Kepe, and many others that what had happened over the past 20 years or so within that program, much of the land allocation that had happened and went to people that had some form of a political connections, mainly men, and there was not a lot of bias towards women and the young people, and we have to have a bit of bias on that. And there is a beneficiary selection criteria that we had worked on as part of the land reform panel experts that the president had appointed in 2018 to say how should a beneficiary be selected to benefit on that. But I think once then that is done, we have to address the fundamental issue around financing, which is where I think the land bank can play an important role in the financing aspect. Because if then we don't, because in South Africa, we've been talking a lot about the land and the markets and the other things, but not a lot about how to ease the financing and what are some of the better instruments that can assist the Black farmers to progress. I mean, yesterday, I'm just sitting here in Taung with the range of Black farmers that have the skills, are trying to farm, supported by SAB. But when you talk to them, the issues around infrastructure, the issues around them wanting expansion, all of them go back to the issue of land access as well as the financing part. So we do need to do something there, because the off-taking thing can be sorted out as soon as the product become of a certain standards, with I think they can be able to achieve that. And that can begin to see the Black farmer participation in the commercial space increasing. And that Black farmer participation is very important. Although the government will still have to support the smallholder farmers, but I think we need to see the anchor Black farmers getting into the commercial space. And this is where the government policy also is pointing at. Now, my second last slide, many of you may have heard the president in the SONA saying the Black people, South Africans now own nearly 25% of land in agriculture. Where the president gets that figure is actually the one that you see at the tail end of that chart. At the bottom there, the 24.9 achieved by 31st of August 2023. This is largely from the work I've done with Johan Kirsten, Johan Broman, who trying to really look at how the land reform has been. What you see in the board is pretty much the evolution of land reform. But what he should have clarified perhaps in that slide is to say nearly 25% has been achieved, but it's both in the Black South African hands and the government. Not necessarily all of it to Black South Africa, because there's a difference between government and Black South Africa. And part of it is that 2.5 million hectares that I've circled there. And the range of the others have been bought on the private purchases by Black South Africans, and the others has been really through cash transfers on land restitution and all of that. But that's the amount of land. Now, if you consider then the 2.5 million hectares, it may look small, colleagues, but you have to consider that if you look at how much we plant for all of our summer grains in South Africa, your maize, soybean, sunflower, and everything else put together, we are planting that in about 2.5 into 4.5 million hectares. Now, if you have 2.5, which is more than half of that, that just gives you a perspective of how much we can go. But of course, not all of that 2.5 will be for crops or for fruit. About 1 million hectares of it is actually for animal production, for livestock. And then the rest, which is about 1.5 million hectares or so, it will be for both field crops as well as the storing of the fruit. And this is where also the jobs and everything that even the people at the NDP had talked about to say there's a mid job that is possible within agriculture and agro-processing. They were assuming also the release of land and innovative support that could follow that onto that. And I think I must again head towards closing that to say, if we were to able then to move that land into Black South Africans, follow it with financing, have the new younger people that don't have the skill but want to get into agriculture put into incubation or of training of some sort so that they have the skill there after they access the finance and they get into the land, they will see their productivity improving in their farms. And all of that will need to get to the export markets in large part, because the South African market just cannot consume all of that. Then that will mean that on top of the plus 26% volume that we anticipate with the trees that I showed in the previous slide, where I was saying there's a dark blue bars and the light blue bars, that's the volume that we think for some of these fruits will be at the ports. You'll be adding into this, which again then means the logistics becomes ever more important when you're thinking about this. So let me close by maybe a more philosophical point of saying, why are some of us in economics but spending so much time sitting in rural areas and thinking a lot about land and all of these things and agriculture? I think for me, it's better captured by the first point, which is that as a country, we are struggling with about three broad problems. It's the one that you at the school are studying, inequality and poverty. And the second aspect is low growth. And the third aspect is higher unemployment. And from the evidence we've seen, it is clear to us that growth in agriculture can be more effective in reducing poverty within the rural areas. And so it's very important that we focus on that. And this story of the possible jobs that can come out there, they may not be as high quality jobs, but I think as people progress and getting into the value chain side, there begins to be a range of employment opportunities that are there. And lastly, the fact that this is a sector that still has a solid growing path. The exports will be important, the release of land will be important, of which all contributes towards closing that dualism that you see the book talk about. And I've deliberately, colleagues, not focused on many of the aspects that I discuss in the book, because I felt that these remarks that I've made in this 30 minutes are some of the things that in the near term are really on top of mind. And if we are not addressing some of these things, we can as well forget about people having the flexibility to accommodate some of the new entrant farmers in their activity and seeing this sector becoming more inclusive, because these hindrances that I've highlighted here, they also present financial pressures even from some of the people that are inside. And again, the idea is not to have the one scale commercial sector, but the idea is to have more representation within the commercial sector, growing that agricultural pie while the government continues to support those that are in medium and the small scale farming side.